Today's episode is taken from a live conversation I hosted on the Noon Vibe app, a place where we explore all facets of health, dive into real psychology behind change, identity, and resilience. This one dives into what happens when we tie too much of ourselves to a single role, outcome, or goal, and how building a more fluid sense of self can actually make us stronger, more adaptable, and more at peace. If you enjoy this, you can find more episodes and conversations like it and even join them live on the Noon Vibe app. Hope you enjoy it. Cultivating a fluid sense of self. So I want to start with a moment that most people don't see. It's not the gold medal. It's not the press conference. It's not the highlight reels on social media. It's what happens after the finish line when the camera's cut, the podium is packed away, and you're left asking the question, now what? All right, Podge, why are you using clearly a sports metaphor for this? And now I will tell you why. In February 2022, there's a Swedish speed skater, Niels van der Poel, and he won Olympic gold. And then he did something that is unexpected, something that is so outrageous for a top performing athlete to do. He actually published a raw, detailed document unpacking how he trained for the Olympics. Like, details galore in it. Astonishing stuff. Most people like to keep their cards close to their chest, especially when the margins are so small at that level. So the fact that he actually published this in itself was astounding. But more importantly, he spoke about how he trained to stay whole. And what do I mean by that? He talked about things like eating cake with friends. He talked about avoiding over-identification with being an athlete. He talked about living outside the ring on purpose. But what I think is really telling and really special about this as well, he realized something. He actually realized that if your entire identity is built around performance, winning can still leave you feeling empty. So he engaged in a lot of family time. He had no issue whatsoever going out on the weekends. He actually had no issue having a few beers, going out for food, spending time with friends, spending time with family, which you might think as a professional athlete these days is crazy. I play Irish football. It's very much an amateur sport. It has eased off slightly in the last, since COVID, really. Before that, you'd have managers come to you and say in January, right, lads, no going out, no holidays, no having a few drinks. We have a game in August. And I'm not even joking. What is that? 8, and it could be sometimes 9 months into September. And that was amateur level. So to think that a professional athlete would engage in social activities, spend time with friends, spend time with family, in a way you could say, was he not fully focused on what he was trying to achieve? He is going to the Olympics after all. And I just love it. I love that he came out with that. I love that that's what he said. I love that he said his entire identity, he didn't want to build around the Olympics. He didn't want to build around the sport singularly. He didn't want to build around his performance, because winning can still leave you feeling empty. And that's the tension we're going to explore today. The danger of tying your entire sense of self to one outcome, one role, one goal, or just one identity. And that is something I'm actually wrestling with myself, and we'll get onto that very shortly. So whether it's the athlete who steps off the podium, or the person who loses 30 pounds and still feels lost, or the professional who hits the career milestone but doesn't feel any more confident, like, this episode is about building a more complex and fluid sense of self. Not just to feel better in the hard moments, but to sustain the habits that actually matter in the long run. So Brad Stulberg, in his book Master of Change, makes a really strong case that the people who handle transitions the best in sport, in life, in health, aren't the most disciplined or the most intense. And that was a tough one to wrestle with, because if you think culturally, the amount of emphasis that is put on this intense kind of hustle culture. As I mentioned in previous podcasts, the 4 a.m. club, the you can sleep when you're dead type of mantra, right? Brad is bringing a different perspective here, using Niels van der Poel's example. So they're actually the people who are most adaptable. And that adaptability comes from identity complexity. So having multiple parts of your life that matter, that interact, that can support you when one area gets shaken up. So Niels van der Poel figured that out before he even won. Yeah, 100%. He trained to be more than a skater, more than a winner, more than a name in a headline. And actually, because of that, he didn't just perform well. He came out of it intact. So that's what we're digging into today. Why a rigid identity can derail your goals, what a fluid identity actually looks like, how to build interdependence into your habits, and what this means for your own pursuit of health, performance, and purpose. Let's get into it. Essentially, you're doing the thing. But slowly, and almost without realizing it, the goal becomes who you are. You're no longer someone who is running, you're a runner. You're not someone eating well, you're the healthy one. You're not just building a habit, you're building an identity around discipline, control, or effort. And that's a good thing. We have actually discussed on the podcast how that identity piece can be key to helping you follow through with your habits. And it can also feel motivating. But after reading The Master of Change by Brad Stulberg, after seeing that story from Niels van der Poel, I realized that it's also fragile. Because the second something shifts, you miss a week, you get injured, life gets messy. It doesn't just threaten your routine, it threatens your sense of self. So that's the trap of rigid identity. It gives you direction, but it doesn't give you much flexibility. It does motivate you until it turns on you. So Brad Stulberg calls this out in Master of Change, that when we define ourselves by one narrow role or one singular pursuit, we leave ourselves incredibly vulnerable to disruption. It's like building your house on one pillar. Strong when everything's perfect, but one shake and the whole thing starts to wobble. So Stulberg draws from evolutionary psychology here. And I think it's a really powerful insight. The systems that adapt best aren't the most specialized. They're the most complex. So the systems that adapt best aren't the most specialized. They're the most complex. Now that might sound counterintuitive, especially as I said in the culture that rewards being all in. But in nature, in business, in mental health, complexity is what allows something to bend instead of break. And complexity in this context means your identity isn't locked into one domain. So it means you can be a person who trains hard and someone who values rest, or someone who tracks their food and doesn't panic if they eat off plan. Someone who is deeply committed to their health and still shows up for relationships, creativity, joy. So think of it this way. If your entire sense of progress comes from your weight, then the second the scale stalls, you might tend to feel like a failure. But if progress can also come from how you speak to yourself, how you show up for your kids, how you rebuild after a hard week, you're building resilience into your identity. So you're not just performing habits, you're weaving them into a life that can hold you. So Stulberg contrasts two really powerful frameworks here. The independent self, which is very common in Western culture. I am what I do. I am separate. I must master and control. And then the interdependent self, which tends to be common in Eastern philosophy. which is I am part of something bigger. My identity exists in relationships to others, to nature, to change itself. And in reality, we need both. Mastery doesn't mean choosing one identity and locking it in. It means staying rooted in who you are while allowing yourself to change. And that's what Niels van der Poel figured out. He didn't become less disciplined. He became more complete or more whole. He didn't drop his ambition, even though a lot of people might think, hey, but he was going out the weekends, having a few drinks and eating out. He did not drop his ambition. He dropped the idea that it had to define everything. And the ironic thing about that is that's actually what made him unstoppable. So not the intensity, but the complexity. Next, I want to talk about strategies and coaching tools, right? To be able to build a more flexible identity. So we spoke about rigid identity. We spoke about what a flexible identity is. So how do you actually do this? How do you build a more complex, more adaptable identity? An identity that supports long-term change without crumbling the second that something goes wrong. So that's essentially what we want to do, right? We want to build a more complex, more resilient identity. So here are 5 practical shifts that you can make. A lot of these might seem very subtle, not dramatic at all, right? They're not these identity overhaul kind of steps for you. There are small levers that you can pull, right? Subtle ways to design your thinking, your habits, your self-talk, so you can build strength without feeling like you're a prisoner to rigidity. Number 1, expand your self-description. So most people define themselves in very narrow terms. I'm the disciplined one. I'm an all or nothing person. I'm a runner. I'm someone who always sticks to the plan. But the more tightly you hold onto that label, the harder it becomes to adapt when something changes. So instead, you could try this prompt. And this is just an example, by the way. You have to work with your own belief and value system and what works for you. But you could say, I'm the kind of person who, insert what you like here, could be shows up even when I don't feel like it, or cares about health, but also about connection, or knows when to push and when to pause. So, as I said, it is very subtle, but the key differentiator there is it leaves room for nuance and it leaves room for being a work in progress. Number 2, make multiple buckets matter. So Brad Stulberg talks about identity complexity as the idea that when we're more stable, when we have multiple sources of meaning. If everything in your life, your confidence, your joy, your sense of control, if that all depends on one thing, maybe it's your diet, your fitness tracker, your job title, then there's an argument to be made that you have built a brittle system. But when you have more buckets, and when I say buckets, these could be relationships, creativity, nature, play, rest, purpose, then you are much harder to shake. So in terms of a coaching tool, you can create your identity inventory. You can write down 4 to 6 areas of your life that matter most and how you want to show up in each. So these could be health, relationships, work, curiosity or learning, spirituality or reflection, fun or joy. Then you ask, am I giving energy to all of these? Or am I putting it all in one basket? And that's something I like to do personally, right? I like to think of as having buckets and making sure each one of them being filled. And you can often check in with yourself as well. I can often notice if there's something missing, right? I'll have a think about it through those buckets. And very often it'll be like, okay, I'm going to the gym X times a week, but I haven't actually spent time with my family. I haven't gone out for a meal with my fiance or anything like that. So I'll prioritize that then.
So you're trying to keep a balance of all the different buckets as well. So you could ask yourself, am I giving energy to all of these, or am I putting it all in one basket? And this helps to give you perspective and more than one place to feel a sense of progress. Number 3, practice identity fluidity in micro moments. So you don't need a life crisis to practice adaptability. You can build it in the small stuff. So let's say you plan to work out but slept through your alarm, or you had what you would consider a perfect nutrition streak, then you ate something unplanned, or you feel tired and want to rest instead of doing your usual routine. Those are not failures. They are practice reps for identity flexibility. They're signs, clues, signals. So instead of saying, shoot, all right, I messed up, you might try, what does the current version of me need right now? What bucket do I need to fill? How do I stay connected to my values even if today doesn't go to plan? Can I pivot? And can I pivot without shame? That's real strength, like staying in motion even if the direction changes for you slightly. Number 4, detach progress from proof of worth. So one of the most damaging patterns is this. If I don't make progress, I'm a failure, or I'm failing. If I'm not succeeding, then I'm not enough. We all have these thoughts. I would say it's actually very, very natural. Our internal narrative can tend to lean into this side of negativity. But real change doesn't come from proving your worth. It comes from living in alignment. So your habits should serve you, not validate you, serve you. So try reframing progress as a form of care and not control. I'm training because I value feeling strong, not to prove I'm disciplined. Or I'm eating well because I care about how I feel, not to prove that I'm good at this. I'm resting because I'm human, not because I've earned it. And that is one we very much commonly fall into. I've said it before, but we tend to view rest as like the end product. Like when everything else is done, oh, finally, now I can rest. But you don't have to. You can prioritize that as well. So the more you separate self-worth from performance, the more sustainable your progress actually becomes. And number 5, design for interdependence, not independence. And we are just taught to believe that change is a solo pursuit, that you just need to want it more or push harder. But as Stillberg points out, and actually, as many guests have pointed out here before on Noon Vibe, the people who navigate change well don't just rely on grit and determination alone. They rely on others. They ask for help. They stay connected. They don't isolate when it gets hard. They lean in. If you're trying to make a health or habit shift, this could be key. And you can use it to ask yourself a few things. Who am I sharing this with? Who helps me feel seen when I'm not on it? Who can remind me who I am when I forget? Because we tend to forget. Sometimes we just get caught up in the mundane, like everyday life. Life is busy as well. And sometimes we don't reflect. And that's where others can come in and be really helpful here. So you don't need to do it alone to be strong. In fact, doing it with others could make you, and I would say would make you stronger. So the bottom line here, if your identity is too rigid, progress can become brittle. But if you build a life where multiple parts of you matter, you can absorb the inevitable changes. They will happen. And you can keep moving forward, and you can do so with stability, with grace. And that is a huge strength, and it's putting you on your way to mastery. Next, let's talk about the integration, right? So from ideas to identity. And I just want to pause for a second, not to overanalyze, but let's try and connect the dots here. You've heard the theory, you've heard the tools, but what does it actually mean for you? the listener who's in the middle of building habits, who's trying to grow, or figuring out what progress even looks like. And this might be an uncomfortable truth. Like, most of us start the change journey with a goal. What we're really building is a self. And sometimes the reason that you feel stuck isn't because your plan isn't working or it's broken. It's because the identity behind it is too narrow. So you're trying to fit all your progress into one definition, one label, one behavior, maybe sometimes even one metric. And the second life throws something unexpected at you, that could be the job stress, it could be the week off, the social pressure, the plateaus, which we've discussed in length. When that happens, it feels like everything starts to slide. But that's not because you're weak. It's because the identity holding that change did not have enough room. So here is what a more flexible identity might sound like in action. I didn't hit all my goals this week, but I still showed up at X%, and that matters. I'm allowed to be proud of progress and want more. Both of those can be true, by the way. I can rest and still be someone who cares deeply about my health. My worth doesn't evaporate when I lose momentum. I can rebuild. I'm not just here to change. I'm here to integrate that change into who I am. So you might be thinking, but Podge, aren't those just soft affirmations? And I would say, no, they are not. They're real psychological frameworks that help build resilience over time. And if you are interested in the idea of resilience, Brad Stulberg is definitely a good resource for you. Because if your identity can flex, you don't have to have fear around setbacks. You don't have to protect your image or hide your struggle. And that is so key, right? It just means that you stay consistent, you keep showing up. You don't just do it when things are good, when you're highly motivated, when things look impressive. But you do it when it's real, when life gets messy for you too. So you can have a challenge for this week. You can pick one moment where you usually judge yourself. Maybe it's missing a workout, eating differently than planned, or maybe you're just not feeling it, right? You're not on it. And instead of reacting with a rigid identity, you can ask yourself, what would a more flexible version of me do next? Not the perfect version, not the one, as Niels van der Poel said, not the one just to perform on the big stage. Just everyday version here. That's where change really does stick. And that's why this idea of having a flexible identity is absolutely key. Next, I'm going to move on to a few questions that I've got over my coaching practice that I believe you might have, or you might be thinking as well. Of course, at this time too, if anyone does want to drop me a message, if anyone wants to join in live in the conversation, feel free to click that guest button and I'll be able to bring you in to discuss as well. Question 1. I've lost a lot of weight, but I'm scared I'll fall back into old habits. How do I stay grounded without obsessing over it? And this is a really common question that I do have. And I think it's very understandable, right? I think when you are trying to build habits or maybe change an aspect of your life, fear is a very, very real thing. And it often comes from tying your identity too tightly to results instead of values. So if your only anchor is, using an example we've used here before, if your only anchor is the number on the scales, for example, then just imagine it. You might have even done it. I've definitely done it in the past. When you're in that situation, when the scales, that metric is everything, every single fluctuation, it it can be great, right, if you're going in the right direction, but it can feel like a threat if you're not. But if you shift your focus, if you can shift your focus away from that one metric and focus on how you want to live, and what I mean by that is the values behind your choices, you create stability no matter what the scale says. So try asking, what kind of person do I want to be with, thinking of the buckets, with food, movement, self-talk, regardless of the outcome? So let your habits reflect your identity. Don't let them replace it. Question 2. I used to be like so good, or a lot of times I get the question, I used to be so good, so on it. I used to have my routine nailed down. But lately, I felt like I don't know who I am. I don't recognize myself. How do I get that version of me back? And it's this is a tough question, by the way, because the honest answer is like you don't. But that's also not a bad thing. So that version of you, that previous version of you was real, and maybe exactly what you needed at that point. But life moves, we all get older, context shifts, energy changes. So the question isn't, how do I go back? It's, how do I move forward in a way that fits where I am now? And Brad Stulberg's work is very clear on this. Like, real mastery isn't about holding a static self-image. It's about adapting and holding your integrity as well. So instead of forcing yourself to become, quote unquote, past you, you can ask, what do I need in this moment in time? What does this season of me actually need? What would progress look like with the resources that I have and the resources I have right now? Question 3. I feel guilty resting or slowing down. Like I'm not living up to the identity that I've built for myself. And this is an incredibly common one, especially when we've built an identity around high performance or discipline, which is sometimes we're forced is not the right word. Sometimes we're led to believe that that's what we have to do, right? As I said, we're in this hustle culture. We're in this, I'm going to do it for myself. I'm going to make it happen. And in ways that's admirable. And in a lot of ways, a lot of people can be like, hey, Podge, what are you talking about? That's exactly what I did. I feel fantastic. So not to say that it's impossible, but it can be hard for a lot of people. But what I would say to this is guilt is often a signal here. Not that you've done something wrong, but that your self-worth is still too entangled with the output. So here's a small reframe I can offer to you if you feel like that's where you are right now. Rest is not the opposite of discipline, and it's very much a part of it. Now, the good news is there's a lot of research, people like Brad Stulberg coming out speaking to the importance of rest and not having it as the last thing that you do as well. So there is some good stuff there. So if your identity can include rest, recovery, I don't know if you want to call it softness or kindness, in terms of how you treat yourself, internally and externally, and also adjustment, right? Then you don't lose momentum when your life shifts. You adapt, you regroup, you keep going, and you stay connected. So you can try practicing saying things like, I can rest and still be someone who shows up. Or I can slow down without losing who I am. So that actually isn't it. It sounds soft, but I guarantee you, I promise you, it is real strength. Question 4. What if I feel like I don't know who I am anymore? And I discussed previously on Noom Vibe. When you do join in, if you are on the Noom program, a lot of often the first question you get asked by the program and by your coach is, what's your big picture? What's your ultimate why? And it really is trying to tap into just that, trying to get you to identify who you are. So this is a really, really common question, right? What if I feel like I don't know who I am anymore? This is more common than people admit, especially after a big transition, like losing weight, changing jobs, becoming a parent, facing burnout, you name it. So here's the invitation for you. Don't rush to redefine yourself with a new label. And what I really like to get people that I work with to do here is, instead of trying to define with a new label, you start collecting evidence. Not of who you should be, but who you're becoming. So you can look for moments of honesty, of care, of connection, of resilience. And that's your identity formation in motion. So ask, what parts of me feel most alive right now? What values are showing up in how I live, even in really small ways? And do not underestimate what you might consider small ways. Where am I growing? Not for everyone else to see, not for that podium moment, right? Just for you. And that's how your identity evolves. It doesn't evolve all at once, but it just piece by piece is how it works. All right, next I want to speak about how one identity isn't realistic or can't hold for your whole life. And I think this is one of the biggest learnings I've got from Niels van der Poel's story and from Brad Stulberg's book as well, Master a Change. And it's something I've had to reframe, because I was actually been on here before, I would say about a month ago, saying how I identify with being a footballer. But after more introspection, that's not just how I identify. I have more of a complex identity, right? You identify as a partner, you identify as a family member or a community member. There's so many that you have, but we tend to just hyperfixate on one. So let's end with this part of the conversation, right? A single identity can't hold your whole life. Maybe it can, but can't hold in isolation. It might feel really good, like really sharp, really clean to say that I'm a runner, or I'm the healthy one, or I'm someone who always shows up. But what happens when you get injured? When you're tired? When your priorities shift? When the very thing that used to drive you just doesn't drive you anymore? If your entire sense of self is tied to doing, if you act in that way, I think the moment life demands like a different pace or something else of you, a different direction, you might get the sense like you're regressing, like you're disappearing. And that's what happens when we tie our identity to one role, one behavior, one outcome. What Brad Stulberg and people like Niels van der Poel are reminding us of is this: if you want to last, not just succeed in the short term, but grow over time, your identity needs room to move. You need to build a life where it's okay to change, where being the person who shows up looks different in different parts of your life, where care and control can both coexist, and where ambition and self-compassion can live, and they can live side by side. So think about your real life, not the curated highlight part of your life or Instagram version, right? Not the version of you want people to see. The actual, what are we now? The actual Tuesday morning, the Thursday afternoon version, whatever you want, the just got back from a trip version, the I'm trying to stay messy, or I'm trying, but it's life is messy type of version. So that version of you, that ultimately is you, right? It needs to be held by identity that has layers. So layers like I'm someone who tries even when I'm not perfect. I care about my health, but I don't sacrifice my sanity for it. I value progress, but I don't chase it to prove that I'm enough to myself or to anyone else. I'm more than what I eat, what I track, what I lift or produce. That's where resilience lives. Not in never missing a step, because we will, but in just having that confidence and knowing who you are and what you do. So if this episode lands anywhere, let it land here, right? You don't need a bigger goal. You don't need a narrow identity. You need a wider identity, one that can stretch, bend, hold steady when life shifts underneath your feet. I would say if you can take that, that's incredibly smart, right? That's not giving up. That's growing. Because at some point, your goals will change, your circumstances will change, they'll shift, your routine will probably break. But the self you're building underneath of it all, that is what will stay then. All right, let's kind of land out with this one, right? We can finish up. This episode was not about changing your identity. It was more about expanding it. So it can hold more than one version of you. So it can survive a setback, essentially, so it can flex without falling apart. So you don't need to cling to the high-performing, on-the-go, highly motivated, always on it type of person. You don't need to prove anything to anybody. You need a sense of self that can stay steady, be flexible when circumstances shift too. And if I was to sum it up, like that is what growth is, right? It's about adaptation versus always being high performing. So there's a concept I came across when I was researching for this. I am probably not going to do a good pronunciation of it here, right? So in Japanese culture, there's something called yurigani, and it means unshakable. But it doesn't mean rigid or unbendable, basically, right? It means something more like this. A tree that bends in the wind but doesn't break. And that's the energy I want you to carry this week. So you be the kind of person whose identity has roots, but whose branches can move. So be proud of your habits, but don't wrap your whole worth around them. And then when life shifts, because it will, don't try snap back into the older version of you. Instead, you can ask, what would it look like to meet this moment as I am now, with care, with strength, with enough flexibility to be able to stay rooted to myself? So that is not the end of your progress. Like that is how you keep growing and keep going. That's it for today's episode on cultivating a fluid sense of self. If it resonated, you can hear more from me over on the Noon Vibe app, where I host live sessions and deeper dives, or you can check out the Podgecast social media, where I share more reflections and tools. Thanks for listening, and see you at the next one.